There's nothing that gets the heart pumping like the book of Job, right? There's a complexity to Job, obviously, that we'll get into today. Esther, in many ways, was a more delightful read.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and I think we needed Esther after, the Judges and Samuel and First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles. What a relief finally to get Esther in there, right? However, I have to say, with my other child, Stephanie, we were talking about Esther, and I was praising Vashti.
Yes.
Thinking, well, she stood up to all the drunken friends of the king, right? And I think she deserves some praise, and my daughter wasn't having it.
I agree with her.
So
Yeah.
What did she say?
Is it repeatable?
Yeah. She felt I was missing the point of the story, and it does not praise Vashti.
Yeah.
You agree?
Yeah, I totally agree.
Because
Well, because Vashti did what she was meant to be, what she was meant to do. Just like Judas did what he was meant to do when he betrayed Jesus. And it was in their character to be that way, but God used them to do the purpose that they were meant to have. She was never meant to be queen. That's why she was supplanted. She was there temporarily and then was meant to be taken out because God's will was to bring
so you're
Jesus.
saying on God's perspective.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it's to bring about.
I still
Esther.
think
Yeah. She was bad.
I had to drop it because my daughter, I could tell, we debate quite heatedly in our family. And so Aaron said he'd keep quiet because he doesn't want to get into the discussion.
Yeah.
But I can tell you as a father, he's going to get into the discussion today. That's just what we do. And so she got, so I'll have to go back and I don't think that was, I can't remember if that was her point or not, but I was just so surprised that Vashti got no points in her book,
We'll give them some.
Well, great to have those who are joining us online. Great to have a few more people here alive. That's great.
Everybody.
It was a meager group last week, right? It was kind of meager, and but when you looked at who joined live or live stream and then who watched the video, we're always in the 50 to 55 range. So some people who were not here were watching at other places, whether live or the video. It's the most we've had viewing the video of any of the ones we've done. Cool. I don't think it was just because it was Esther. I think it was people who travel, and this gives us opportunities to participate even when we're not here. I think that's the point. So that was we're really happy about that. And for those that don't be shy, those who are live stream, just raise your hand or say something, and Beatrice will point out to me, that you're there. Okay. Before we start, we're going to watch two videos today. The first one, I think we've shown before, but maybe a couple of years ago. And that was something the Bible Project called the Wisdom Project. And they talked about wisdom books and especially lifted up Proverbs as a wisdom book, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And I was tempted to play all three of them because I believe we're supposed to read all the wisdom literature together because they're talking to each other. Proverbs, as we'll hear, comes at life like Deuteronomy, that life has a moral arc to it. And if you live good, then probably you'll have more greater success, right? Probably what we teach our kids, right? It's not 100%. If you're good, things always work out. But the rate of things working out is better if you live a morally good life. And if you live a morally bad life, you can expect problems, right? Would anyone disagree with that? That's Proverbs. That's Deuteronomy.
What?
Ecclesiastes, remember, all is vanity, all is smoke, comes at life very differently. saying there is not that moral structure to life. Just look around, the bad prosper, the good suffer. All that stuff you read in Proverbs, take it with a grain of salt. In fact, it's all smoke. Life is smoke. If there was that moral structure, we'd see different things in our neighbors. We'd see different things in the world. We'd see different things in the papers every day, but we don't. We see a whole different. And so what is wisdom when you're coming at life a little bit more cynically, right? Is there still wisdom? So Ecclesiastes, in a way, is another corrective, or at least provides another dimension of life with God than Proverbs. And now you've got Job, another person who's going to take on Proverbs and say, well, okay, sometimes really bad things happen to good people. Why is that? Who do we blame? Right? And can we blame? And so we're going to take a look at God. There are some famous quotes. Virginia Woolf wrote famously, I read the book of Job last night, period. God doesn't come off too good. I think that's a general feeling that what is the character of God that we discover in Job? So I'm going to encourage a nuanced reading of the book. And so this is kind of what Aaron and I were discussing this morning. Before we got in the car, when we got out of the car. What does the book say about God? And so saying that, I want to start, first of all, before we show an initial video which introduces Job as wisdom literature. By the way, is Job Jewish?
No.
No.
Is he a worshiper of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? No.
Land of Uz.
Which is what?
I think it's modern day Syria or Jordan in that area, I think.
So we don't know his religious background, although it's in the Jewish scriptures, right? So there's certain implications that they're pulling from it, but we don't have any specifically Jewish context.
Who wrote the book of Job?
Some people claim Moses, but they're not sure.
But
He's been studying.
Matt comes loaded from there. We don't know, but I think Matt's right that many guess it was an early. This is a story going back way to the patriarchs, right? Where you don't have already formal religious practices, you don't have temple, you don't have covenant, you don't have some of those things that are more formal, right? That happened after Moses and then in the promised land. So an old story, interestingly. But we are approaching wisdom, which is an interesting topic. Just what is wisdom? How do we get at it? How do we live according to wisdom? So as I know many of you have read the book before, do you have feelings about Job? Have you studied it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you embrace it? Do you reject it? I mean, do you have, what's your relationship with Job?
Actually, I don't want his friends
Yeah.
at all.
Always three friends.
I read Job in several different versions, first in the Revised Standard and then in the Living. And you say this is not
Not a translation.
yeah, it is. It's a funny thing, but it reads like Jewish people talking to me. Now listen to me.
Yeah.
Hear what I say over and over and over and over again.
So what happens, just remind us about his three friends.
They think he's sinned.
Hmm?
They think he's sinned somehow and God's
Must have done
punishing
something.
him.
Because they've read Proverbs. No, that's exactly their living according to Deuteronomy and Proverbs, which was to live wisely, you obey the commandments, and then good things happen. If you do bad things, obviously, bad things happen and God's punishing you. So when they look at Job and all the bad things, what is their what does their instinct
He's
tell them?
been
Guilty.
What did you do, Job?
He
You
says
know, you gotta come clean. We're your friends. Come clean. And what does Job say?
I'm righteous. I didn't do a thing.
And I think they were trying to do something good for Job, because they were trying to get him to confess so that he wouldn't have all these troubles.
Yeah,
Exactly.
they didn't do anything.
Exactly. But then he's pushing back and saying,
I didn't do it.
I know what you're saying, but no. Now, do they buy into his moral integrity? His claims of moral integrity? They don't.
No.
They didn't seem to.
They don't. And so they keep on and on. And at the end of the book, did you notice in 40, again, Aaron and I were just discussing that, God's almost ready to punish them at the end.
Yeah.
In fact, he says, why don't you go and really fast, have a barbecue, make a sacrifice.
Right.
And then if you do that, I'll listen to Job's prayer
For you. Yeah.
for your mercy, right?
Yeah.
Job
That'll punish you.
forgiveness, that's part
So-
of the moral of the story.
What I like about the Friends is we've all had friends like that. So the story reads honestly. You're going, oh, yeah. I get what they're saying, and yet this is what Beatrice is working on now. How do you do ministry in, let's say, a hospice situation or a hospital situation where you don't make matters worse? So you can imagine going to a hospital, someone struggling with cancer, and you go, so what did you do?
Don't do that.
And
I love how
that
you
can
do it.
happen
Yeah.
pretty quickly, right? And it's not always the person coming into the hospital room, but in our families, the people who know us best, right?
He
There's
deserves.
something that we have that instinct in us. So a woman is attacked at night. And so sometimes, instead of blaming the attacker, where do we go?
They blame her. She
What
should've
were
been
you
out
wearing?
there.
What were you wearing?
Why were you
Why are
out
you out
late
at 2 in the
night?
morning? Right, so
Exactly.
we go to Proverbs.
Did you smile?
Yeah.
That's right. Were you nice? You must
Say hello.
And then it's almost, you must have done something.
Yeah.
To have crossed that. And let's be honest, we've all been in those types of situations. And then we say, what, did I do something? I think maybe I did do something.
Question yourself.
Why that happened, right? And sometimes it's true, but here, Job, it's not. He claims his integrity.
What about his wife? She tells him, curse God and die,
Yeah.
basically.
They need marital counseling.
She wasn't trying to-
Marriage is
Afraid to say what she thinks, which
she's not holding back, So what is she trying to say?
Well, if you die, then this whole thing will be done and over with, basically.
And
won't be
who's at
suffering.
fault?
He must have been.
That's right. You're the source of all.
God's at fault. So why are you being faithful? It's another pretty honest voice. Honest, what I mean, we get it. Saying, why are you being, why, Job? I tell you, why are you following that God who's treating you this way? And we're going to get that voice from Job later on as well, where he's going,
Right, yeah.
my wife who died, who you killed, she's starting to make some sense to me. Now, is she lamenting to God? It's kind of interesting in the story. The Jewish tradition is you can shake your fist at God, but you have to be shaking your fist at God, not telling your spouse you should hate God. So it's more of a prayer to God, the lament tradition. And I don't do that well.
But
We
it
don't.
acknowledges God.
It acknowledges God. That's the whole point. But it's a pretty dramatic tradition in scripture where you have lament psalms. How often do we use those in worship? Never. And in fact, in the hymn, not the hymn book we have now, but the hymn book before it, they actually took a few of the lament psalms out because they were afraid we'd use them. And I've told this story before, but when I was visiting in 1995, visiting refugee camps after the genocide in Rwanda, and visiting worship services in these camps just to see how do you worship after a genocide. And this one woman got up and it was a triple translation. She was speaking a local dialect and it was translated in Swahili, which was translated to English. So it took a while for me to just catch up with what she was saying, but she got up and she was angry in the worship service, really angry. And she was wishing that the children of her enemies, those who had killed her family, that their heads would be broken open on rocks and killed. She went into detail. It wasn't, I just want them dead, but I want their, rocks and I'm listening to this, this is a worship service. She's up like testifying.
Mhm.
And as the translation's starting to come down and I'm, working through my horror that this is a worship service, I realized suddenly she's quoting the Psalms.
Mm.
Was it 139, 137, whichever, well, 139, I think. And I thought, how sophisticated that her anger was being expressed through the word of God. She'd been taught, obviously, not just to break out in anger, but to actually use scripture to express her sorrow and her anger, her hatred. I thought that, she can't read, but the sophistication spiritually of what I was watching, I thought was amazing. And then I thought, could we do that
Wow.
in a worship service, express anger like that? Let's say after Ian or after, some event. I don't think I could. I don't know. So then I went to our psalm, the book of Psalms in the hymn book, and realized they had taken that psalm out. And I went, not only could I not do it, I couldn't have used the hymn book and done it. And so, they admitted their mistake and then our present hymn book is back. But the idea was those planning our worship were not comfortable with this same tradition, this lament tradition. But then that leaves us all just with our anger. That's, I go home and I get angry, but I'm not using it in any sort of prayer or formally in lament publicly that we're encouraged, I think, to do in both Job and this literature. Are you gonna jump in there? Were you
No, I
were
like
you-
all that. I did have a thought. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I've always loved the first chapters. To me, without it's unlike any book in the Bible where it starts with there once was a man named Job, and the heavenly beings came in before God. So you're getting like, we're going to tell you a story about Job, but first let me talk about what's going on in the higher realm. And to your point about morality.
And what was going on? What was going on?
Well-
Say more about that.
Well, to the point of this realm, you get a glimpse into this realm where heavenly beings are coming before God. And what is so neat is God starts the conversation. God says, where have you been? To Satan. So you're like, wow, that's crazy. And then Satan's I'm going to and fro the earth. And then God brings up, to your point, the moral thing. He's making a distinction between the contrasting of whatever Satan stands for. He says, have you looked at Job? He points to Job, which is interesting. In the Lord's Prayer, it says, save us from the time of trial. And it looks like Job is about to start a story of trial. But you're really, to your point about a moral, there is something in the universe that God says, this is a man who's upright and righteous. And Satan is whatever the opposite of that. And so they're in this dialogue, and now it's kind of like, let the story begin. So think about that from even any glimpse from like Peter or even our lives. If, they're saying, have you thought about my servant Matt? And the conversations that might be going on. Anyways, you don't
Yes,
get,
you want to say,
Uh-oh.
don't, no.
that's right. But you don't get that kind of, anywhere else in the Bible, you don't get that.
So
sort
it's
of
important.
heavenly.
There's a royal, what Jim's talking about, there's this royal, and all the gods are gathered, all the, we call them demigods, whatever, but they would have thought things like the sun, the moon, right? Those who are having powers in the universe. Interesting, Satan said, when God says, where you been, to and fro on the earth. So that's where he's got his work. Now, this is where my son and I debated this morning.
I was gonna say, it's not past tense. He never asks where have you been. He says, where'd you come from? So it's not like you've been somewhere else, that's past tense. He said, where'd you come from? As
The
in,
earth.
I don't know
The
where
earth.
you've been,
From the
where
earth.
have you been?
Yeah.
Not where did you come from, right? So like, that distinction, I think, because what happens with, to your point, which is that God does bring it up and says, hey, look, no one else is like this person, right? And Satan goes, yeah, well, how much do you really know about this person? Like your details, how much do you actually know? You're just saying he's like no one else. I've kind of been walking around.
I think I can prove otherwise. Now, it's interesting, we know this story. So Jim says, oh, and Aaron says, we know about this conversation between God and Satan. It bothers us, okay? It bothers us. Does Job ever find out about that conversation?
No.
But doesn't God give Satan the permission to go torture this man?
Yeah,
Up
it's coming
until
up,
the
yeah.
point of death, right?
But just
do
don't let
whatever you
finger
want.
on.
But I don't know,
Yeah,
I
he did, but he
wouldn't
did
say
say
it
he had
bothers
all
me
these sweet
because
songs.
Yeah.
it's somewhat, I mean, we know the beginning, the end, and the middle, so it's a unique glimpse into a heavenly realm that the conversations and the movements that happen and may happen over Peter and Moses, all these conversations could have happened because this gives you a type of glimpse into that.
And I think that's the point. That's the point, is we're more like Job. We don't know what's going on in the heavenlies. So it gives us a glimpse of a mystery that now we know because we're reading Job, but Job didn't know. And then it questions, what are the powers and the principalities, to use New Testament language?
Well, aren't we in the human realm with Job? And that Job, God has set him up to be an example of no matter what happens to a person, you still trust in God. And people will see that Job was innocent. And possibility, the human sin could be, we have sacrificial lambs on earth to suffer for the people that have, for us that we have sinned in life. And God threw everything at Job, but he set up an example, I'm gonna trust in God. And maybe possibly with the human realm and the spiritual realm, we have two, but Job's in, the human realm that.
So we got 2
Do you
points there.
think that is a possibility?
Yeah, there's 2 points you're making, which I think are really, we want to hold on to that, then we're going to watch the first film. One is, what is the wisdom? What's going on in the earthly realm? Do we fully capture that? And you're going to find out in the story, God's going to tell Job, you don't even understand the earthly realm, right? There's things going on, there's a higher wisdom, the way I put it. However, there's a lower wisdom, good and evil, that is kind of upsetting in the story. It's upsetting to Job. I was righteous, so I'm not suffering because of my sin. I'm suffering unjustly. And then the second is, what is the moral of the story? And you're kind of leaning into, what are we supposed to pull out from this? And it's interesting, some, I think, will go in that direction and say, trust in God no matter what. Others will say, a God who's willing to do this to me, I don't know.
Yeah.
And you notice that that's like a Jewish response after the Holocaust. Some have doubled down on their trust of God as chosen people. Others have said, I'm out.
What if Job had known about the conversation? That
So what do
God
you think?
gave Satan the permission
We would have a
to
little resentment,
destroy his
right?
life. I don't know how that.
Jokes are playing on him, kind of, because it was a game between him and Satan.
Yeah.
Well, Satan, they called him the accuser. Is he the same Satan or?
Does Job know he's gonna get everything back at the end?
Of course, no.
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 No, so
That's not a 1-for-1 either. I just want to point out. It's not like, oh, so I got all this other stuff taken, like, daughters and sons. Oh, you gave me new sons and daughters. Cool, we're fine now. Yeah. Wait a minute, what happened to them? That seems unfair to the daughters and sons that got taken away.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's not a 1-for-1. It feels to me the more kind of like.
And we also disagree this morning, is that a reward? God doesn't say it's a reward. Now, Aaron said that's implicit. He was faithful and God rewards him. And
Well, blessed him.
I'm not so sure in this book, we know Job does not know why things are happening to him or why he gets all the blessings at the end. It's like God's hiding God's motives, like they're higher, but never actually tells. He couldn't tell Job, let me tell you what happened, It's a funny story.
It's a funny story, yeah, right.
Me, it could be our Jewish Job coming in here, He never tells Job. And I think that reflects our situation, that when bad things happen, sometimes we don't know why. We're like Job.
Yeah,
But we want things to be fair. God never promised, as far as I know, that life was gonna be fair.
Yeah, no, God is not.
I think that's at the heart of this book. At the heart of this book, that life is not fair. God is not fair. Or there is a fairness or a wisdom, I'd say, not that at the end, God says, you're just not able to grasp it.
Yeah, that we can't understand.
Yeah.
But let's jump into this first video. And this is part of their wisdom series. And I think gives a really good introduction to
There are 3 books in the Bible known as the wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. The first, Proverbs, showed us that God is wise and just.
Yeah, we learned that God has ordered the world so that it's fair. The righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. In other words, you get what you deserve.
But then we meet Ecclesiastes, who observes, people don't always get what they deserve.
Yeah, he said the world isn't always fair, that life is unpredictable and hard to comprehend, just like smoke.
And this makes you wonder, okay, well, is God wise and just?
Exactly. And so it's that question that is being explored in the final book of wisdom, Job.
All right, let's dive in.
So Job begins with a strange story that takes place up in the heavens, which are described something like a heavenly command center. So God is there with these angelic creatures called the sons of God, and they're all there reporting for duty.
And God points out this guy Job, his servant, showing how righteous and good he is.
And then one of these angelic creatures approaches. He's referred to in Hebrew as the Satan.
The Satan. Who is this?
Well, this word is actually a title, which literally means the one who is opposed. So out of this whole crew, he is the one questioning how God is running the world. And he proposes that Job might not actually love God, that he's only a good person because God rewards him. If God were to take away all of the good things he gave to Job, then we would see his true colors.
So he thinks Job is just working the system?
That's exactly right. Maybe he's obeying just to get what he wants.
So God agrees to this experiment and allows the Satan to inflict suffering on Job.
And Job loses everyone and everything that he cares about. It is devastating. And remember, he deserves none of this. God himself said so.
The remarkable thing is that in the midst of all this suffering, Job still praises God.
At least for chapters 1 and 2. But then in chapter 3, we find out how he's really feeling inside. He unleashes this poem that reveals this devastation. It's a long, elaborate curse on the day that he was born.
After this, some of Job's friends come to visit him to offer their help. And all of them are like, Job, you must have done something horribly wrong to deserve this. After all, we know God is just, and we know the world is ordered by God's justice and fairness, so you must be getting what you deserve.
And for the next 34 chapters, the friends and Job go back and forth in very dense Hebrew poetry. His friends keep speculating about why God might have sent such suffering, and they even start making up lists of hypothetical sins that Job must have committed. But after each accusation, Job defends his innocence.
And Job is innocent.
He is. He's also on an emotional roller coaster. At some moments, he's very confident that God is still wise and just.
Yeah, in other moments, he's doubting God's goodness.
He even comes to accuse God of being reckless, unfair, and corrupt. So by the end of the dialogue, Job demands that God come and explain himself in person, and God does so. He comes in the form of a great storm cloud.
Now, God doesn't give Job a direct answer. He doesn't tell Job about the conversation with the Satan.
Yeah, he does something very different. He takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe. He shows Job how grand the world is, and he asks him if he's even capable of running it or understanding it, just for a day. He shows Job how much detail there is in the world, things that we might see every day, but really don't understand at all. But God does. He knows it all intimately. He pays attention to the beauty and operations of the universe in ways that we haven't even imagined and in places that we will never see.
Then to conclude, God shows Job two wondrous beasts and brags about how great they are.
Yeah, they are dangerous. I mean, they would kill you without even thinking about it. And God says they're not evil. They're actually a part of his good world.
And then that's it. That's God's whole defense. It's kind of weird. I mean, what was this all about?
It seems to be this. From Job's point of view, it looks like God is not just. But God's perspective is infinitely bigger. He's dynamically interacting with a whole universe of complexity when he makes decisions. And this is what God calls his wisdom.
So Job asking God to defend himself is actually kind of absurd.
He couldn't comprehend this kind of complexity even if he wanted to.
So where does this leave us?
Well, it leaves Job in a place of humility. He never learned why he suffered, and yet he's able to live in peace and in the fear of the Lord.
But that's not where the book ends, because after this, God restores to Job double everything he had lost. And this, again, is surprising. I mean, is this a reward? Is God saying, congratulations, Job, you passed this elaborate test?
No, I mean, the whole book just made the point that Job losing everything was not a punishment, and so now getting it back isn't a reward.
So why does he get it back?
Well, apparently, God, in his wisdom, decided to give Job a gift. We don't know why. But what we do know is that Job is now the kind of person who, no matter what comes, good or bad, he can trust God's wisdom.
And that's the book of Job and the end of our wisdom series.
These biblical books of wisdom are amazing. Each one offers a unique perspective on the good life, and you need to hear all of them together as you learn to live with wisdom and in the fear of the Lord.
We're gonna just stay together for a second. Reactions.
I think Job is us. And throughout life, I think you progress and you trust God, and then the next thing happened and you think about it and think, well, maybe not so fast. And it's just, and eventually you have to say, let go and let God, but it's a process.
Well, I think that we are thinking about one person, ourselves, or Job. And God works through the universe. And this, whatever happens to us, might be what needs to happen for someone else to do something in this world. You never know where it's coming from. So yes, we have bad things happen to us, but you have to believe there's a purpose behind it. And that God is working in mysterious ways, and we can hardly comprehend it.
It's good. You know, I just love the Bible Project. It's
I do
just so much baked in there. So that's just the first was amazing. But it was interesting. I see sort of the arc of formation of, like, I have my little granddaughter Abigail. Proverbs, you teach her right and wrong, and they smile when things are right and they cry when things are wrong. And then you move into where we all get to maybe college and there's that temptation of cynicism. Ecclesiastes, you know, the heck with this world, I'm done with it. And then somewhere in life, you come across suffering, right? Cancer, loss of a loved one. And you don't have answers. You don't have answers. And so you kind of
And
have.
God doesn't give answers.
God doesn't, but you're not abandoned.
Right.
And there's some awakening. I don't know how it comes through people or whatever. There's an awakening to a deeper rhythm to the universe and God's grace. And so sort of, you know, it's not something you're going to digest when you're 5 years old. It's in the arc of sort of Christian maturity, you might call it, of eldership as you get older.
So I like that analogy. What's your relationship now to Proverbs? You know, because when you move on, do you just forget the early lessons of good and bad, or
Well, as a grandpa, that's where it seems like every day this simple papa, you know, she wants to steal something, right? Or take something from another kid, or push another child. You are there as the proverb saying, we don't do that. If we push, we get in trouble. If we steal, this happens. They kind of absorb that. They're looking for that. And I'm not ready to talk to her about cynicism. You know what I mean? And suffering, although that might unfold.
Mhm.
So Proverbs, yes, always alive and active, but what's its place in this dynamic? What's in this dynamic of these three things happening, what might be the word that needs to be
and
spoken?
early on, remember Proverbs 1 through 9, you have Lady Wisdom, you have these two ladies, you know, and it's like this simple guy is walking down this city street and there are two ladies, both enticing him to come in and explore their wares. And there's the evil woman.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, because it you know, obviously, it sounds almost like prostitution, but they're making food and they're creating an environment, right? And one of them is Lady Wisdom. And so it's, at least in early Proverbs, it's like you're being torn back and forth, which is sort of a daily experience. You never grow beyond that, right? You never grow beyond Proverbs in that sense. But having said that, there's something in Ecclesiastes and Job that we've got to discover as well. At some point, it's probably going to happen, right? How do you prepare your kids for that? There will be suffering. Right? But,
Not providing a safe space.
what's that?
I said for not providing a safe space when you're in college.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh, your feelings are hurt. Oh, I'm so sorry.
But isn't that part of why we cry when they go to college? We think we know what's going to happen, you know, and you think, have I prepared them for life's, and of course, as a parent, you want to protect as much as you can. So, yeah.
You don't get a blueprint.
No, you're
Oh,
the
you're
first
not.
time.
You don't get a blueprint.
You don't get a
for the
blueprint.
world.
Oh, God, no.
We couldn't stand it if we knew the end. Then I don't think-
Now, Proverbs, I think you're right. Proverbs doesn't offer a blueprint, but it says Lady Wisdom will always be calling out to you, right? She always will invite you to come in, right? It's sort of like an invitation to wisdom.
I think that for me, I do have a problem with the relationship between Proverbs and Job. Because when Job does eventually ask why, and in the crowd says, here, I'm gonna, God displaces his own responsibility. He's actually giving spectacle and distraction to avoid answering the question that Job's asked him. So he shows him all the wonders of the world. Still doesn't answer, why'd you do this? He's just saying, I don't want to tell you.
There can't be enlightenment in that?
No, I
You
think
can't
that,
wake up to like, wow, I never realized
like a
the
boat.
ocean
Yeah.
was so amazing, or the stars.
I think all of those things are, I think it's just a reminder, right? So that's how I read it, is that he's saying, hey, look at all these wonderful things. Job's going, yeah, okay, what does that have to do with the fact that you did this to me?
Wonderful, yes, but also horrific things to look,
Right.
Leviathan
The
and
beast and
the
so
Behemoth.
forth.
And I think the way I understood those, it'd be like nature that we've all experienced here. I mean, it's great to live in Naples, right? All the beauty of the Gulf, I look out at the sunsets, and the moon last night was just tremendous, and it's so wonderful to live on a little island right next to the Gulf until there's a hurricane.
Before we had dangerous, like,
Yes.
And
life.
then all of a sudden, I look down from the windows and what happened to the island?
It's gone.
It's gone.
In my car.
And my car. So that's like Leviathan.
Yeah.
Are the winds and the storms evil?
No,
They have a purpose.
it's nothing personal.
However, who didn't pray, God, what are you doing? Right? Look at the destruction. I mean, you still drive up to Fort Myers, and you're, wow.
But that's what I mean by the spectacle, right? So it isn't personal. All the universe, not personal.
Yeah.
Oh, except the fact that I did this to you, that is personal. But let's forget about that.
That's right. It was.
Let's just talk about
With
the
this,
universe.
with the Satan, it's personal. He's going after Job. It's not,
Yeah. but
it's
this is
not
his favorite.
just, I love the one image here of the ship. And
Yeah,
then
right,
Leviathan
underneath.
is underneath, and anyone who's been in a boat where there are whales or large sharks has that feeling of, whew.
Yeah.
Right? Or even if you're out in a boat and there's a big storm,
Yeah.
you feel the awesomeness of nature and how vulnerable. It's the JF Kennedy quote, his prayer every morning. The sea is so large and my boat is so small. So that's that fear, and I think Aaron's right. There's some points where God's pointing out, look, that's just my good creation. Even though but other times he doesn't tell Job about that personal permission of Satan to do as Satan was going to do. But we know it as readers of the story.
But a master teacher always never, ever, ever answers your question. Even a good professor,
You're
In-
correct.
a good professor in wherever you are, a good professor never answers the question. And that's always where the student is caught off guard. I mean, when Nicodemus said, how do I get to heaven? That's as clear as you could be.
Right.
Jesus says, unless you're born again, what? What are you talking about? And
Does the
so,
professor fail you in the class and say, see, what did you learn? Why? Why'd you fail me? Well, I'm not gonna tell you why I failed you. Okay, well then, what was the point of the class? If you're gonna fail me, but not explain why you failed me in the class as I learned, why did I take this class?
but how did he fail? Because it sounds like Job did wake up to some form of new enlightenment. Job got a new glimpse of God. And I think that's what brings life in faith, is you get a new glimpse of the grace. It's probably the grace of God, the greatness, but greatness alone is not personal, but greatness with grace is very personal. And so we're a part of this big story, but God also touches us personally. It's not all about us,
No.
but we're a part of this big story.
I also wanted to
The way
say
you
this.
ask the question is, why did you fail me? How about asking, why did I fail?
Yeah.
Well, if you're learning, so again, this is a notion of, let's say, to expand the analogy, like, the end, I think that, yes, Job does get a sense of the awe and, I think we're assuming that Job doesn't continuously think about, wait, why did all this bad stuff happen to me in the past, right? There's no indication of that, but I think that there's just sort of an acceptance in like all these things that happened to me, and that's the grandness of the universe. I think I'm always kind of constantly stuck on, okay, well, I was did everything you told me to do in this class. I've done everything you've asked me. And there's been, an acceptance on all my work, right? And it just, based on this text, on a proposition by two professors, I'm gonna fail you to make a point. And so you have to say, wait a minute, I did everything you asked me to. I said, oh, this class is great, I've learned everything I'm supposed to learn, but why did I fail? Well, this class is actually part of a whole grander part of your degree, but I'm just gonna fail you in this class. But we're just not gonna talk about that. Let's just talk about how you're gonna learn more by not taking my class.
And not graduating.
And you're gonna graduate.
Graduate.
Like, to me, that's what I was talking about. I understand, and your points are valid. Absolutely. There's that sort of relationship. You do learn something in the grandness of your own degree. I personally probably am just still like, okay, I still got the degree, but like, it still bothers me that you failed me in your class. Right? Like, what, like, why?
If your assumption is there's not love somewhere in there, then it becomes quite cold.
No, I think we also need to see it in a bigger picture. It's not about failing or passing. It's about you being chosen for a greater purpose. Because it's not the small picture that he's looking at. It's the big picture. So there is more for you than this here. And it's the same story of death to life, of Christ dying on the cross. Did he explain to us why this was happening? Did we know why that was happening in the moment? No, but the resurrection is what gives us the life that comes after the suffering and the death. And the point is that God is sovereign and we can't pretend to understand him or even demand an answer from him. But knowing that people will suffer unduly, but that God's righteousness is at hand, even if we don't see it and even if we don't understand it, that he will bring because he's our redeemer. So he will bring the resurrection body in the end, which is what we see with Job, whether he understood it or not, whether he even tried to justify himself, which by the way, that's when he sinned, trying to justify himself. We can't justify ourselves because only God can justify us by his righteousness. And then the life comes, then the bigger picture arrives, and God is in control, even if we are not, and even if we lose control, we have to know and see the goodness of what God is doing.
So I don't know if this is a fair comparison. I'm going to try to build on the two comments. So what you're describing is more Job. The classroom experience is more Proverbs, because the assumption is the teacher will grade me fairly, which is Proverbs, that life has a moral.
But that's when we try to be good or bad. That's when we're in a trap of religion or in a trap of the law. You see, because we did
How would you
everything
describe
right.
Proverbs?
I would say it's wisdom that is meant to guide us in life, but it's not meant to trap us under the law, thinking if we do it, then we have this result. This is not a formula.
No.
And if we do everything right, then we surely will get a prize. No.
I think
Because
Proverbs would say it's not I like the phrase, not a formula for life, because I think that really fits with Ecclesiastes and Job. However, Proverbs, I think, will say, more likely than not, if you live a good moral life, God's gonna bless you. And more often than not, if you live a bad life, you'll be punished.
but it says boast in your suffering, because through suffering is that we will actually be blessed. So then thinking that if we do things right, that then we will get the prize, puts us in that law, which kills.
But sometimes it seems like it's asking you to jump over your own shadow. In other words, I believe all that, but I still can't help myself wanting answers for certain things.
That's the human truth. That's
So
a
that's where
beautiful truth.
faith comes in. That's where faith comes in. And faith is given by the Holy Spirit so that we can walk through life without needing answers, because we know that God is with us and that his plan is to bring us to that resurrected body, whether we know it or not, whether we see it or not, whether we understand it or not. It's
Specific
faith.
to this test, though, God isn't with us.
He is.
No,
He-
he's in with us.
He's the one that allowed
No,
Satan to
no,
tempt,
I never think
and
it's like-
Satan that's his purpose, to tempt and to give suffering to us. But God does, nothing can be done unless God gives permission for it. So he is with us.
Matt, one more comment?
All I was gonna say is, just think back when God took Job on the virtual tour. Look at me, I'm the creator of the universe and this, look at what I have to deal with every single day. You don't have a, what do they say, a universal perspective. You're in no position to judge me or know anything right or wrong in the whole bigger scheme of things. So you have to have faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes bad things happens to good people for a lesson or something
All
or,
the time.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're gonna go and describe the book again, with again, the Bible Project. Second
That was
video.
good. I watched that one.
Did you?
The book of Job?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought that this time, we haven't always done it, but you know, I love the introduction on wisdom literature. Because seeing Job next to some of the other books gives some perspective and like all of scripture, we're brought into a pretty complex conversation. And the more we can understand these books, the more we can enter into the conversation about God's activities in the world. Okay, let's
Book of Job. It's a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man, and then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you bless him with prosperity. Let Job suffer, then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by 3 friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how this section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend. Then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now, Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent, and so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now, we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way, and so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, Job, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now, it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have a Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just, and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of. Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent, and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind, and he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours, it's extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. he starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile, but more likely they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God, and what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now, this is surprising because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling, how Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored, not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God, and that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
Okay, what'd you think?
Yeah.
Lot going on there. It's a lot going on there. We're now gonna get into just groups here. You know how to do this, 3 or 4 or 6 or however you do it. And as you've heard, that 2 approaches to describing Job. What's your takeaway? Or what is the question that keeps kind of gnawing at you as you hear this rendition of one way to understand Job? Okay, so we'll just take about 10 minutes or so. And again, those who are live streaming, we'll put you in a group as well.
I guess I can just sit back. Look at you dancing like this.
You know, what we're experiencing, or we're together, how good people are we? Because we're not, you know, we're in a fresh world. It's a teaching right, it's a learning process. But I know this is our generation. So whoever is like, yeah, where we at, they're. And that's the danger. To me, that's thinking that good, being good or you know that Because we're never gonna be secure.
Choose God.
So we're gonna want to judge.
I think he used some words that struggled.
So I
He
think
spoke and he prayed.
there we go, an absolution, that's what Luther said to do. You know, with and by our rabbi. So, yeah, and it's very, thinking, oh, I'm religious, so I am now a little, you see?
No, I don't think I'm good.
Good either. Okay, good. So that's important. So now it's just about, okay, we're not good, and then one day we just, when we're not,
At 25, I relate
And
more
it's
to
absorbed,
it.
I know
It's
very
a
criticized.
lot more.
Oh, well, he's not answering. Oh, well, he's not going to. Oh, well, he's letting people suffer who are good. The thing is that we need to go back to God. If he were, we would all. So in his mercy,
I think that's
again,
explaining.
not even Job, this feels like it's beautiful, a double portion for his troubles. But he actually explained to him that so lovely. You know, can you say that with him? To try and help him to grasp.
What I'm saying is, okay, that's part of it.
Amazing divinity.
But
Sovereignty.
She had 2 young sons.
friends have responsibility. And I think
When it comes down to law, is we are in this world,
But God.
but then God's even though you're the rest of the we thought we were the most seen by his making this.
Everybody goes in there on time. It'll be
Be
50 years. My dad.
I'm gonna show you all this kid.
And I was doing study about actually like church shopping, and Pastor Rick was saying, I'm going to I'm drawn to the Lutheran faith, so I know they think about certain things, other things.
It really did. Yeah.
So my phone number said, nothing was 667.
Well, that's what my dad. You know what I mean? How did they know?
He says, well, start out with John, come back next week. Come back and talk about it.
That's right. Yeah, they good kids.
Even if I told them.
Right there.
I haven't. Oh, I just. You know, I just figured out.
Yeah, they're interpreting.